We are talking turkey with a guy who knows all about turkey here in the state of Mississippi, Adam Butler, with the Wild Turkey Program here at Mississippi Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Parks. This is the Mississippi Outdoors Podcast.
This episode of the Mississippi Outdoors Podcast is brought to you by the Foundation for Mississippi Wildlife, Fisheries, and Parks.
Adam Butler is with us, and if you ever had a turkey question, you better hope I ask it, because we can get the info from the director of the turkey program, the Wild Turkey Program here at the Mississippi Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Parks. Adam, how you doing?
Man, great to be here. It's always a pleasure to talk turkeys in Mississippi. So I hope we got time, because we can talk all day.
Yeah, and for you, a kid from Lawrence County, born and raised here in the state, how do you get from that to now not only at Mississippi Wildlife, Fisheries, and Parks, but the director of the Wild Turkey Program? What was that path like?
Well, really, it's a dream come true. I mean, you know, I'm that person. You hear that cliche about, you know, if you do something you love, you never work a day in your life. Like, that's me. I was blessed enough to be a little kid in the 80s when turkeys were really, really booming in particularly like the southern part of Mississippi where I'm from. And so I was just surrounded by them, and I don't really know what it is about the bird, but they captivated me from a very, very early age. So it's like the one thing in my life probably that has never changed. You know, as far back as I can remember, I was crazy about turkeys. And so grew up turkey hunting. That was always a big part of my life. And sometime in my teens decided I wanted to be a wildlife biologist. Okay. And luckily for me, I also grew up a Mississippi State fan, grew up a Bulldog, and Mississippi State has one of the better respected programs for wildlife biology in the whole United States. You know, it's really a blessing to have that here in our state. So it was an easy fit to go be a maroon and white Bulldog, and got a degree in wildlife biology. And then after that, went to University of Georgia to get a master's degree in the same field. And when I was kind of wrapping all that up, a job opened up here, and man, just lucked into it, and I've been really blessed, and wake up every day. I mean, even now, you know, 15 years into a career, I sometimes it hits me like, whoa, can't believe I'm doing this.
Yeah,
you know?
Getting paid to do this.
Yeah.
We talked about that earlier. You were a Bulldog two different ways.
Yeah.
First the Mississippi State version, then a little time at Georgia.
Yeah.
What was that like?
You know, the programs were a little bit different, and but you know, both really well respected in kind of the wildlife and forestry world, and it worked out really good for me. My Georgia experience was actually working on a project with bobwhite quail in Florida through a group called Tall Timbers Research Station, which is a private nonprofit wildlife research institute. So we were down in southern Florida doing work on quail, studying them and other birds that kind of respond to their habitat. And so that was a couple of years over there doing that, and then getting the degree and seeing a little bit different part of the country, part of the Southeast, I guess, and then coming back. So it was good experiences, and I draw from those a lot of times here, you know.
Yeah. You mentioned kind of becoming hooked on turkey hunting as a youngin' in Lawrence County. I think I have heard more people use the word addictive or addicting regarding turkey hunting than just about any other sort of outdoor sport. And regardless of what it is I or anyone else has been involved in, at one point or another, like, I felt like I was sort of addicted to bass fishing, and somebody's addicted to crappie fishing. But I've never heard people talk more about being consumed by something than they are chasing that turkey. Like, why is that, do you think?
Well, you know, it's a good observation, and I'm probably really biased, so you're probably going to get a really biased answer asking me that. But you hear that a lot, and I think a big part of the reason is because turkey hunting itself is so interactive. Like, if you're deer hunting, you know, most people are going to go sit in a deer stand, and they're going to wait, and time's going to pass and all that. And you may see a deer, you may not see a deer. You may know there's a big deer there, you may not see him. But with turkey hunting, if the birds are gobbling, so the gobbling of the turkey is kind of like the whole thing. And if they're gobbling and you're calling back to them, you're essentially having a conversation with the bird. You're back and forth with him. You know exactly where he is. And because you know exactly where he is, and oftentimes they're not going to come to you, which is what you want them to do, it's really frustrating. And I think that frustration sort of builds that addiction, because gosh, he's right there. He's just over that little hill, he's just right around that bend, and I can't make him come over here.
Right.
I want him to come over here so bad, but I can't make him come over here. And so it's sort of that back and forth, I think, that is the thing that hooks everybody,
Yeah. And, sometimes I think about, you hear the term adrenaline rush, okay? And you think about maybe it's, running with the football in a football game. It's very active. I'm moving or throwing or hitting a baseball, or I don't know, dirt bike, jumping, some adrenaline rush. I don't know that there's any less adrenaline rush in the fact, Adam, and you probably agree, that you have to be totally still.
Yeah.
Like I'm trying to call him in, but I can't. If I move, I'm afraid it's going to spook him.
Yeah.
And that there's an adrenaline rush and hoping he doesn't hear your heartbeat at the same time too.
Yeah,
There's
for sure.
That's part of it also.
Oh yeah, for sure. And I mean, so that, that just builds that anticipation, and they're such a wary creature, because there's, if we get into the biology some, I mean, everything in the woods is trying to catch and eat a turkey. And so that makes them be like super aware of just what's going on around them. They don't miss much. And so if you're going to be successful with it, you like you say, you got to be well hidden and you got to be super still and all that sort of stuff. And ultimately that means you're probably going to get it wrong a lot. You're going to fail a lot. And a lot of times you're not even going to know what you did wrong. That's the other, like going back to the addiction, that's the other part of the frustration is so many times, all is, well, the turkey was right over there and he was gobbling a lot. And then all of a sudden, he quit and I don't know what happened. And I tend to believe that more often than not, that's probably because you did something wrong and the turkey realized something is not natural or something's not right about this situation, and he, his instinct kicked in. He said, "I need to get away from there." Mm-hmm. But yeah, if you're not just perfectly still, perfectly hidden, blend in just totally with your surroundings, there's a good chance they're going to pick you out when they come in.
Sure. I'm curious also in the history in regards to turkey hunting in the state of Mississippi. A little reading and studying. You go back a little over 100 years ago, there were not many here. I've actually heard older people in conversation and other things say, "Oh, I remember the first turkey I ever saw."
Oh yeah. My dad can tell me the exact year he saw his first turkey. So yeah. If you go way back, like the early explorers that were coming in, this part of the world, there's a lot of writings that they have. Turkeys were really abundant. They were, and so they're living off of them. They're just making their way through the wilderness and doing what they had to do to survive. But kind of the combination of that unregulated hunting in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And then at that same time, the timber industry then was different than today. It was much more destructive. Today forestry is sustainable, and we have a lot of practices to make sure we're not going to take more wood than we can grow. But back then they didn't do that. So in a pretty short order, in the early part of the 20th century, all of the forested habitats that turkeys needed were pretty well liquidated in our part of the world. And at the same time, unregulated hunting was going on. So kind of the combination of those two things really pushed them almost to extinction. Back 100 years ago, there wasn't like a endangered species category or anything like that. But if there had been, they would have certainly been considered an endangered species. The low point in Mississippi, the estimate was there was only about 4,000 to 5,000 turkeys left in the state. And you compare that to today, where we've got 300 plus thousand easily. They went from not very much to a lot. And it was the loss of turkeys and other game species. There were a lot of species during that era that came really close to being wiped out. But the loss of turkeys was really prevalent on the minds of a lot of Mississippians. And when the agency I worked for, when the Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Parks was formed in 1932, when the legislature set that up, that was that was one of the tasks that they wanted the agency to accomplish, was to try to restore turkey populations. And so that took a while, it took decades, but eventually it happened here. It happened all across the country, to the point where turkeys are kind of one of the real crown jewels of sort of modern conservation, where we almost lost them, and we went through a lot of work to bring them back, and now they're they're something we can all enjoy.
Yeah. And, a curious question. We were talking about concealment now, for a hunter now. Concealment, how hard it is to call one in. And it's almost like baseball. You bat 300, you're an all-star, right?
Right.
So 100 years ago, how did people have so much success in hunting them to the point that the numbers got dwindled like that when they didn't have modern camo and that sort of stuff?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. One, I'm sure most of those people were probably a lot better hunters than the typical person today because they did it all the time. But the other part of that is that there weren't regulations. They weren't thinking about it from the standpoint of we can take from this resource, but we can only take so much.
Right.
They were eating.
It's a food source.
Yeah. I got a great story on that. My wife's grandfather, he's passed away now, but while he was living, he told me he lived to be 98. He was born in 1922, and he told me stories that he turkey hunted in the late 1920s and the 1930s and early 1940s, and he told me stories of that era, kind of in the regulation, hunting seasons and things like we had. And I remember one time asking him, Papa, when did you guys hunt turkeys? And he looked at me like that was a silly question. He said, son, we hunted turkeys anytime we wanted to eat turkey, So it was those sort of things. It wasn't necessarily, I think, that they were more efficient. It's that it was completely unregulated. So there were really no checks on, what was happening to the turkey population.
And that, along with the clearing of timber, which is primary habitat, and there's your recipe, I guess.
Right. One. I go back to my wife's grandfather. One story that he told me that really illustrated just how destructive that era was to a lot of our wildlife. He said during the Depression, it was really common for a lot of country churches to have like Sunday potlucks, where everybody brings something. They call it dinner on the ground or something like that, And he said, everybody was poor. But if you were really, really poor, you didn't have enough chickens to spare for the church country dinner. And he said that was kind of like a blight on the family, not to be able to bring something to the potluck. And he said a lot of those sort of people, what they would do, especially in the summertime, is they would go out and kill turkey poults, kill baby turkeys that are about the size of chicken, and bring them to the church dinner and try to pass them off as chickens. And he said you always knew you were eating a turkey poult because the legs would be a little bit darker meat, And I was like, Papa, that's the reason we almost lost the things. Like that right there, is what did it. But, and it's easy, I think, for us to maybe look down on that. But, it was a different era. And coming out of sort of the pioneer days when, North America was just overrun with wildlife, they thought it was an endless resource, and it took a little while for it to really register for us that that's not the case, and that we got to have these safeguards and rules and regulations and stuff like that to make sure we don't overharvest the population or take too many.
Sure. How about that story? So those numbers, you mentioned those, less than 7,000 at that time. We're talking 100 years ago. And that being a primary impetus or almost a genesis for the Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Parks in the 1930s. And now here we are in the 2020s, and we got a population of 300,000 birds.
Give or take, yeah.
Yeah, and you know them all by name, right?
No, not at all. Wished I did. I wished I did.
But if you were to sort of overview that almost 100-year process and the turkey program for MDWFP, which we're pushing 100 years, if you were to just overview that and in the implementation of programs, ideas, regulations, and seasons to get the turkey population where it is now, what are the bullet points in that overview that this is how it worked?
Yeah. So initially, in 1932, when the department was formed, they really wanted to go about kind of surveying. So the first couple of decades were more about kind of surveying the existing populations and trying to figure out where they were. Okay, and then kind of at that same time, the agency, like a lot of other state wildlife agencies in that day, resorted to trying to use game farm turkeys. So turkeys grown in a pen, and they would go release them, and that was pretty well an abysmal failure. Turkeys that are grown in captivity just simply don't have the wherewithal to survive in the wild. And so we did that for a while, and almost all of those pen-reared turkey releases were epic failures. They didn't last. And so people began to realize that's not going to be the means to get us where we need to go. One thing happened here in, I forget the date it would have been, but so white-tailed deer were also in kind of the same dire straits, and we figured out how to trap wild deer in the few places they remained. And some of the early deer traps just happened to catch some flocks of wild turkeys. And that happened in Pearl River County, Mississippi. And those birds were moved to the area that's now Leaf River Wildlife Management Area and let go. And at that time, there was no hunting on that area. And all of a sudden, these birds from the wild that were taken to this area that didn't have any, they started to really flourish. And so it was obvious that was going to be the method. We got to figure out a way to take wild-caught birds and move them and release them. But for a while, we didn't really have a good technique to do it. With deer they'll walk into a box trap. So you build a box, and they'll walk into it, and there's a trigger, and the door falls. Turkeys just generally won't do that, or eastern turkeys won't. Some of the western subspecies will do that, but our turkeys are too spooky. And so it took a little while. In the 1950s, some biologists in South Carolina were trying to figure out how to trap ducks to band them and stuff. And they developed this technique where they would take cannons with these mortars attached to a big net and shoot them out over the ducks. And people realized really quickly they could do that with turkeys too. So one thing I'm really proud of as a Mississippian is that Mississippi was one of the first states in the country to really grab that technique and start using it for turkey restoration. So we started in about 1955, going out and trapping wild turkeys in wild places and then moving them to these areas that didn't have birds. And at that point in time, there were really only about 3 or so pockets in the state that still had enough turkeys to be able to do that. One was the Leaf River Refuge, because of that earlier kind of restocking, accidental restocking, you might call it. Another was a private property down in Amite County, just below Liberty. And then a third was up on the Mississippi River around Friars Point. And those 3 pockets, for probably the first two decades of the restoration process, were the primary source of all the turkeys that were moved around.
Wow.
So over that period from say the mid 1950s to the early 1990s, as a whole, we moved about 3,500 or so wild turkeys. Catching them in little flocks. Catch 6 or 8 hens and 2 or 3 gobblers, and then release those in an area that didn't have turkeys and protect them, leave them alone. And given time, that would be enough to sort of build a local population back up.
How about that?
At the same time, talking about the kind of the forest and all. So if you go back, a lot of that really heavy timber cutting that happened in the first couple of decades of the 20th century, you fast forward another 40, 50 years from that, a lot of those forests had grown back. And so by the 70s, a lot of that timber stuff had kind of grown back into turkey habitat, big woods that turkeys like. And so you kind of had a combination of the habitat had grown back, and then we're moving these birds around and dropping them off. And it worked. And turkeys really started booming. And like I said, our state really experienced, most of the state, the northern part of the state was a little bit later, but say the lower 2/3 of Mississippi, during the 1980s were probably some of the highest turkey populations in the United States at that time. And I think that because we were early on doing that, and we had really high huntable turkey populations when a lot of the rest of the United States was just starting that process, that's why you see Mississippi so well represented sort of in the turkey hunting world. Like if you look at the hunting industry, gosh, we go down the household name brands that are from Mississippi, based in Mississippi, that have some sort of tie back to turkey hunting. You talk to people like Will Primos or Toxie Hayes, they'll tell you they started their company because they wanted to figure out how to outsmart turkeys. All the other stuff came later, but it was turkeys that were really the thing that got them going to figure out how to outsmart that bird. And I think that's because, the conservation process had started earlier here. So we had birds when other places didn't.
Didn't have them. It's fascinating, for me, someone, okay, so obviously wasn't involved in it. I'm hearing you describe relocating these turkeys in the history, and again, we're talking about going back to the 50s. You got 3 pockets. You mentioned where those are. And then I can blink my eyes and flash it to now. And I live in a place like Tupelo, and I was thinking, well, I don't know if how many they released years ago in Chickasaw County, but you can drive up and down the Natchez Trace and, buddy, they're there now.
Yeah.
So my question is, all the other parts of the state, the population, is it a migration? Was it releasing in all those parts? Like, how did that happen for that population
and
to
that's a
spread?
good question, because a lot of, a common thing that we get hit with now is people know about that process, right? They're aware that happened, and so they think, well, if I don't have turkeys now, you guys just bring me some, and drop them off, and that'll fix my problems. Well, that's not really relevant today because of what you said. Most everywhere in the state has some turkeys nearby, right? And even back then, when that restoration, that trap and restock process was active and ongoing, it wasn't like you would think. It wasn't like there were just trailers full of turkeys being dropped out. In most places, like I said, it would be 6, 8, 10 female turkeys and 3 or 4 male turkeys, and their reproduction in good habitat and when everything's going right is so high that little very small starter flock would be enough to grow to populate a pretty large area. Yeah. So there's a number of counties in the state that the whole of what they got in restocking may have only been one little flock, maybe 15 birds, and that was enough given time to repopulate entire counties in some cases. Yeah. So it's just a matter of them having the right stuff, and then they their biology kind of takes over and they can flourish. Going back to Mississippi, I'm really biased, and I think Mississippi has a really special place in the turkey world. And not only did we kind of start the restoration early, and not only do we have all of these household name brands that are synonymous with turkey hunting, but talking about the Bulldogs, Mississippi State University was one of the first places that really undertook really deep turkey research. So when you get past kind of that restoration phase, or kind of towards the tail end of it in the 1980s, it became clear that turkeys were going to do pretty well, but we didn't understand a lot about them. There's just a lot of kind of the basics of what makes turkey tick that we didn't know. And so beginning in the 80s, or actually in the 70s, if you go back a little bit earlier than that, our agency began partnering with Mississippi State University and funding turkey research, and particularly a couple of really long-term projects on Tallahassee Wildlife Management Area, and then another one in Kemper County on private timberlands in Kemper County. And again, those, it's not to say that other researchers in other places weren't doing turkey research. It's just at that point there had not been a lot of it done, particularly with radio telemetry, where we're putting collars on them and able to follow them around and stuff. And so those works that were conducted here in Mississippi by Dr. George Hirsch at Mississippi State University were really some of the very seminal early research to try to just document the basics about what makes a turkey. And they were so well done that, even today, almost 40 years later, a lot of that research is still held up as sort of the gospel on how to understand turkeys, So our state, not only has a really rich history with the restoration process and the hunting culture around it, but also the science part of the deal. I mean, we're a player in the turkey world.
Yeah. From habitat, food source, all those kinds of things go into that turkey's world. Not only, in other words, what you're saying is not only is Mississippi one of the prime locations in all of the world in terms of, for a place for a turkey to live, but in terms of leading the way and understanding them. It happened right here pretty early.
Yeah.
It's really cool to think about. What about pressure? Hunting pressure. In the fishing world, I always hear about fishing pressure, and that can affect a fish. What about hunting pressure and how that has worked and is working in the state of Mississippi.
Well, we have a lot of turkey hunters,
And more it seems like each year.
we do, and that's so. Even though we have had a turkey hunting culture, arguably us in Alabama, I don't want to slight them, but us, some of the deep South states, we've had a turkey hunting culture longer than a lot of the rest of the country. We're still finding room to grow. I mean, turkey hunting is gaining in popularity. It's one of the few forms of hunting, if you look nationally, that hunter numbers are growing. We're not losing turkey hunters.
Yeah.
And in fact, based on the estimates that we probably have more turkey hunters right now than we ever have had. More and more people are taking it up and getting that addiction, I guess you could say.
Sure.
So that's kind of a blessing and a curse in a way. I mean, it's a blessing in that more people are interested in turkeys. So, that means more people willing to do things to help them, more people interested in managing habitat for turkeys, all really good positives. But the flip side of that is there's more demand on that resource than ever. And so that's something we got to keep an eye on.
Sure. Well, and I guess that would be my next question. I heard a recent interview you did within maybe the last year or so about taking a good hard look at the seasons, the start of the season as it pertains to like what day and obviously the time of year. It's not a deal where y'all have set the season. Here's what it is every year, even though it looked that way for a while. It's looking for any way possible, isn't it, to kind of tweak that, even if it's tweaking the season, start and so that it works for the bird population, but also works for the hunters.
Yeah, right. And that's a good point. That trying to find that balance is
Right.
really important to us. And and again, I'm probably biased in that our agency has always wanted to be very cognizant about hunter opportunity. We want to give people every chance they can to get out in the woods and enjoy the resources we have. So we did. You're referencing a study that just sort of wrapped up. Again, we partnered with researchers at Mississippi State University on. There's a lot of questions about the turkey hunting season and how it affects them and those sort of things. And so we took a really deep dive with a whole bunch of data to look at our spring season. And what we ultimately concluded is, and this is it is somewhat counterintuitive, but the hunting season itself is not really the thing that drives the number of turkeys over time. Okay, and that's partly because of the way we regulate it, right? So we're only shooting the adult males in our case. We don't even shoot the juvenile male. Well, kids can shoot jakes here, but for the most part, we're only killing adult gobblers, and they're when it comes to their contribution to the population, it doesn't take very many adult males to sort of get done what needs to happen with the reproduction. And so what you see is what drives turkey populations all has to do with the females. It has to do with the survival of the hens, how many of them make it from one year to the next. It has to do with the nesting, how successful the nests are. It has to do with the poults, how many of them survive. And so hunting doesn't really affect that part of the equation. The part of the equation that really, really matters is not the thing that hunting in the way we do it, shooting only the males at a very, specific time of the year and all that. It's not the thing that really is driving the population as a whole. So we feel like, other states, take different approaches to it. But, like I said, here, we got a lot of turkey hunters, and they want to be able to get out in the woods every chance they can. And my view on it is, if we got to make sure we're not hurting that resource, and that's part of the reason we went through sort of that research process with all of that data. And if we're not tipping quite over that line, we want to maximize time people have in the woods. And so we looked at that and kind of came to the conclusion that we don't. The approach that we've had in the past is we can't see where it's causing any problems. Yeah,
that's really cool. It's also sort of amazing to sit back and think about all the things that go into it. That someone like you, okay, as the manager of this wild turkey program, that you have to consider. You mentioned something a minute ago. I've heard you say before. Everything out there is looking to eat a turkey. It isn't just me and you.
Right.
Okay. Well, so that when you talk about nuisance animals, coyotes, other things, that all factors in too. You know, so it may be another arm of the agency, Wildlife Fisheries and Parks, that what they're doing has a great effect in what you're trying to do.
Right.
And I don't know that everybody stops and thinks about that all the time. You know?
Yeah. Oh, it's definitely all interconnected. And, you know, one of the ways that we try to address all of that is to try to, as best we can, get better habitat on the ground, because, you know, it does hurt you to know that predators are going to get some of them. I mean, it's unavoidable.
Right.
But if we can give them really great habitat, number one, they're going to be better equipped to sort of avoid predators. You know, like take a hen sitting on a nest. You know, she can't fight off a coyote. Her only defense is to remain hidden. And so we need to be sure we've got the right kind of vegetation and on the ground out there to keep her hidden when she makes a nest. You know, likewise, you know, turkeys use their eyesight to avoid predators. So we got to make sure our woods are managed in such a way that they can take advantage of that. They can see a long distance in you know, places and that sort of stuff. So how like the agency works together, yeah. So we've got biologists, whether they're managing, you know, some of our public WMAs, they're thinking about turkey habitat. They're thinking about, you know, they may not be thinking about turkeys exclusively, but they're thinking about habitat and how it affects a lot of different critters. So we're trying to make sure we're getting good stuff out there that's going to benefit turkeys and give them every advantage they can. On the private land side, you know, we do a lot to help private landowners, both, you know, giving them recommendations, helping them implement practices and that sort of stuff. So if turkeys are going to be around, you know, another 100 years, it's going to be because people who care about them, hunters and landowners, are doing the things that provide them the resources they need. You know, like I said earlier, going back to the restocking thing, it doesn't take very many of them, doesn't take very many turkeys to grow and be really super abundant if they've got the right stuff, you know. So so we're kind of now in this era. We've been sort of through the, like I said, the restoration. We've done a lot of research, and we're continuing to do a lot of research. But I think we're in an era now where, you know, the focus really has to be on providing them habitat and providing, you know, the stuff that they need to thrive.
What are the main predators?
Well, that depends. So it depends on what life stage you're talking about, and I guess that's probably a biologist-y sort of a term. But if you're talking about grown turkeys, you know, there's not really that many things that can take down a grown turkey. Humans are probably the main predator of adult toms, adult gobblers. You know, but if you start looking at hens and other things, I mean. Bobcats are a big one. Coyotes will get a few, especially hens on nests. Fox will get a few, especially hens on nests. One that a lot of people don't appreciate that can be just deadly on them are great horned owls. So we got several different owl species here, and the great horned owls are the really big ones with the little tufts, you know, little tufts on the top of their head. Yeah. And you know, they're the largest avian predator we have, I guess, besides eagles. But they're really agile, and they're big enough to take down a turkey if they need to. So those are kind of the ones that get the adults. But like really, what the predators that matter are the ones that are affecting the nest and affecting the little ones. And so then you're talking about, you know, raccoons, possums, skunks, some snakes. Snakes will eat eggs and things. So those are the ones that are going to eat eggs, which has a massive effect on the future population. And then when they hatch out, you know, they're little puffballs for a couple of weeks, and they can't fly. And because of that, almost everything eats the little ones. I mean, you know, pretty much every predator we've already mentioned will try to eat poults. And then, you know, you can throw in a lot of the smaller hawks and things like that, snakes. It's, you know, it ain't easy being a turkey. And you know, that, to me as a turkey hunter, like anytime I look up and do kill a gobbler, like sometimes it'll hit me like, whoa, this guy's been through a lot to get here. You know, if you're talking a 2 or 3 or 4 year old gobbler, man, he's evaded a lot of dangers in his life to be able to give me this moment in memory. You know,
really cool. All right, Adam, I'm about to ask you what is probably a very novice question. Flying, how far, and how, in terms of their flight and everything, a turkey, like how far can it fly? Where does it fly? How long they stay in the air?
That's a good question. So what I've read before is that they top out. I think it's somewhere around about 55 miles an hour.
Okay.
would be like their top speed. And I'm pulling that from memory, but
That's
I think that's
moving.
right. Yeah. I don't know that I've ever seen like what their maximum distance they can fly. But like what they do, they're really not geared for long flight. They're geared for like quick, short bursts. But if they get in the right setting, you can watch them. They'll take off and they sort of set their wings and just sail. So I know people that hunt over on the Mississippi River that have seen them fly the Mississippi River. I mean, so you think
one side or the other.
yeah. So I mean, of course they're not flapping that whole way. They're getting a burst and then they're gliding for a long ways. But I mean, you think the river's possibly a mile across in places.
Right.
And, you talk to people that hunt up like in the Appalachian Mountains. You'll hear them talk about having a bird on a ridge in the mountains, and he just decides he wants to go to that mountain over there and just takes off and sets his wings, and sails. So I don't really know what the furthest they could go would be, but probably surprise us, I guess.
Kind of depend on the wind and all those things. I know if he's jumping the Mississippi River, he better judge it right.
I mean, they're not going to do like a duck and just pack up and go to North Dakota or anything, but they probably can fly further than we would appreciate.
And that's the other thing too. I've heard enough tales at times that you'd hear some of the descriptions when they run. Mm-hmm. You'd think they're describing them running 55 miles an hour. Man, I didn't know a turkey could run that fast, but they can hit the ground and move when they need to.
Oh yeah. They're geared for running. I mean, you look at those muscles in the leg; they're made for it.
Sure. Well, it's fascinating to get to talk to you about all those things, and just sort of get a glimpse of a little bit of an overview of the history of the wild turkey, the program, the population in the state of Mississippi, how it's grown. What do you see as you kind of look ahead? Again, I know you mentioned some research. It's just concluding that affects kind of the decisions that are made on different things. Mm-hmm. There's always research going on. There's always things you're looking at down the road over the next 5-10 years. For someone who's listening to this and they think, okay, I'm new at this. What's it going to be like for me as a turkey hunter in Mississippi in 5-10 years? What are the goals? What's sort of the overview of what we think we're going to have?
Yeah. I think we're in an interesting place with wild turkeys because we've talked a lot about sort of the successes and the good run we had for decades, from the 1950s to the 80s and 90s. And we did hit a little rough patch here recently. So a lot of the population data and stuff that we keep, started tracking down 15 or so years ago, depending on where you're at in the state. And so that didn't just happen here in Mississippi. It happened across a lot of the country, especially in the Southeast. And so, a lot of the, meetings with colleagues that I go to in other states, it's been a big worry for, a decade or more now, like what's going on with turkeys. And because of that right now, if you look around the country, there's probably more turkey research going on right now. Not probably, I know there is. There's more turkey research going on right now around the United States than there has ever been. And that's because, we saw some trends in the data that alarmed us a little bit. Mm-hmm. So we're learning more and more all the time. But that can be that can, make you get a little anxious. But I actually think it's maybe a positive in a way because in the last, just say the last 5 years, there's been a tremendous amount of interest in turkey management and people, again, going back to just landowners and hunters wanting to do things for the bird. And I think one of the kind of the byproducts of sort of going through that era of just really super abundance that we had that kind of came about in the 80s and the 90s was that people just sort of took it for granted that we're going to have a lot of turkeys, that they're just going to be here. And that's not necessarily the case. We see 100 years ago, you can lose them if you don't take care of them. And that's true with any wildlife species. And I think now with turkeys, we're kind of entering this era where people want to be much more conscious about what they're doing and trying to manage for them. And I kind of liken it to the change that has happened with deer hunting over, let's say, the last 30 years. If you were to go back to, 1990, we had a lot of deer hunters. People go to deer camp, they shoot some deer, and then they'd go home and they wouldn't think about it again until next year. And because of a lot of different things that happen, the DMAP program that our agency was a part of, entities like QDMA and others that started talking about quality deer management and managing herds and thinking about harvest decisions. And then after that, just sort of the rise of all kind of things, food plots and habitat management, all this sort of stuff. Now, you can't hardly find a deer hunter who's not thinking about deer management 365.
Right.
They may love the hunting, but they also love the management and the doing things to their land, and they're constantly thinking about how to improve it for whitetails and that sort of stuff. And I really think with turkey hunting, we're entering that same era, that if you went back 25 years, turkeys were just here and people went out and hunted them. We've hit a little bump in the road where we saw some numbers drop. We saw some issues, and now people are realizing if I want to have this bird in the future, if I want my grandkids to hunt this bird, I've got to be doing stuff. I can't just rely on the state. I can't just rely on the universities. I've got to be doing something.
Sure.
And so we're seeing a lot more interest in a lot of the management practices that would be really beneficial for turkeys. Prescribed fire, for instance, that's one of the greatest techniques you can do if you've got piney woods anywhere in the state, is to burn your woods. It provides a whole lot of good benefits to turkeys. And man, there's been a huge rise in interest in prescribed burning by private landowners all across our state. So I think the future is actually maybe a little bit brighter just because of that, because we did, like I said, hit a little bump in the road, a little rough patch, numbers dropped. People realize, hey, I'm not seeing quite as many as I did 10 years ago. And now more and more people are worried about that. They're wanting to do things about that. It's resulted in certain policy changes here within our agency. But I think, ultimately where the rubber's going to meet the road is people who hunt, people who own property, making decisions that are going to be in the best interest of the bird.
Right. And that was kind of really my last thing I was going to bounce off of you, is for someone, and you mentioned like prescribed burning, for someone listening who their thought right now is, okay, I love this sport. I want my sons and kids and grandsons and granddaughters to enjoy the sport. What can I do? What are the things that I can do to do my part, as a hunter?
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, limits and that sort of thing and obeying the law in that regard is pretty obvious. But what would you say to them and say, I'm a hunter. I just want to do my part to help. What can I do?
Well, I'll have to give you a biologist answer to that. It depends. It's going to really depend on your particular situation. On if we're talking about like managing at the property level, I guess let me step back before I go there though. Like a bigger thing would be get engaged. There's a lot of different groups out there that are trying to do things for turkeys. In National Wild Turkey Federation, mm-hmm. Turkeys for Tomorrow. There's other groups, so you can get plugged into those and help raise the funds that fund the research and fund a lot of the stuff. Dive deep into sort of what makes the bird tick. Like I said, there's a lot we don't know about turkeys, but there's a lot we do know, and a heck of a lot of what we do know actually came from studies right here in Mississippi. So, you can get online. We've got a lot of resources where you can learn more about turkeys. When it comes to like a particular piece of property, though, it's going to really depend on what you got. The recommendations that you might give to a property, right along the Mississippi River might be a little bit different than what you might give to a property owner in Lee County, for instance. But again, we've got resources as an agency. We got biologists, every day of the week who are meeting with hunters and meeting with hunting clubs, meeting with landowners to try to help them make those sort of decisions, and point them in that direction. So there's resources out there if you're interested. And again, I think the more interest we can get and the more people we can get doing active stuff, the brighter the future is going to be.
Yeah. Adam, really fascinating to get to hear you talk about what you do and the wild turkey program here in the state of Mississippi. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, man. Thank you. It's a blessing.
Yeah. Really cool. Adam Butler with the Wild Turkey Program here at Mississippi Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Parks. You've been listening to the Mississippi Outdoors Podcast. Thanks for listening. We'll see you outdoors.